Hello and welcome to episode 18. Now we should have been looking today at recording choirs, but it suddenly occurred to me that we really need first to consider a little bit about what actually stereo is. Recording in acoustic spaces can be incredibly frustrating. The idea, after all, is generally to recreate a live sound in a recording. Now, we're not talking about multi-tracking, we're not talking about tweaking and twisting and re-recording and overdubs. We're talking about stereo. The concept where if you closed your eye, you could actually point to the guy who's playing the flute, or you could point to that person who's in the background with a slightly nasal voice that you can hear. You know where they are. So it's all about recording a stereo field that approximates as close as you can real life. So before we go anywhere, we've got to look at how do we do that ourselves? How do we function with our ears? Well, two ears, one either side of our head, and that's evolved over the years because it functions with two scientific principles. There is a difference in volume between what we hear in each ear, and there's a difference in time. So if we hear a sound source over there, it hits that ear first, travels round my head, and then goes into that ear, which means it's quieter, and it means it took longer to get there. So we have a difference in the pressure that goes down my ear canal and wobbles my eardrum, and we have a difference in the time it takes to get from there to there. So those two functions let our brain know where something is in the stereo field and even how far away it's likely to be. It's quite clever because we still struggle with that with audio recordings. We get a bit of a clue because the volume is slightly less and there's probably a time delay built in, but it's nowhere near as precise as our ears appear to be able to do it. Now, what you could do, do you remember these little microphones that you see people clip to themselves? Little omnidirectional mics. They don't need to be pointed, and they're really, really popular. Very, very common. You could put one of those on each ear. You could stick one either side of your head, and they're going to approximate what your ear can hear. So if you recorded two of those and then played it back to in-ear monitors or ordinary earbud headphones in your ear canal, you've actually captured pretty much what your ears would have heard. It's got lots of problems, of course, trying to do that, because if you were to move your head, the soundstage would follow your head. So it would be a rather bizarre sort of way to record, but you could do it. Some people actually do buy dummy heads that have microphones in false ears. And you can use those to make these rather scientific but very accurate recordings. It lets your brain do exactly the same processing job as your eardrums would have done if you'd been there. But those sort of things are a little bit odd to take to a recording session. I would imagine you get some very strange stares if you turned up with one of those dummy heads to do a recording of an orchestra. You could do. There is actually also a little device called a Jekyllin disc, which is a circular disc that you put end on. It's actually got sound absorbing material on both sides, and the idea is it acts a little bit like your head, and it provides a barrier between that ear and that ear. And a Jekyllin disc with a couple of omnidirectional microphones on each side is also a perfectly valid way to record. But again, you get that slightly sterile type of recording. It's very, very precise, and it's very, very much the way that your ears work, but it is not quite how we expect a recording to sound. I think we like to know that a recording is a recording and it's not actually real, and that makes a big difference. Typically we end up with a couple of microphones that we put together in a certain way that allows us to tell whereabouts things are in our stereo sound field. Now, the most common one that we use is called a near coincident pair, or we might call it XY. The idea is the diaphragms in your two microphones are put as physically close together as you can possibly get, so that they're nearly in the same place. And then the usual starting point is 90 degrees. Now that works because of the polar pattern of the microphone. In most cases it will be cardioid. And with a cardioid microphone, you've got to remember that when we turn them round, that's our starting point. That's the on-axis direction, and that's the most sensitive part. We get the most out of the microphone. As soon as we start to rotate the microphone away, at 90 degrees, we still get some pickup. It removes itself when we get to 180 degrees, and that's the null at the back of a cardioid where the connector goes in on these type of microphones. And that's where it's at its least sensitive. But it does have pickup there. There's not as much as there. And it's that difference that we take advantage of. If we have the two, an instrument in that direction will be louder on this top microphone. This one, it will be quieter. But if we have another instrument over there, on that axis, it gets the benefit of the highest gain, and this one is lower. So as we point them that way, something in the middle is equal in volume on both microphones. The pressure will be the same. And as they move that way, it changes. And move that way, it changes. And so our stereo is coming from differences in pressure that arrive at the microphone. The amount of time difference that we spoke about between ears is missing completely. We are not paying any attention whatsoever to the arrival time, because with the microphones having their business end so close together, there is no practical difference in the arrival time between over there and over there. If we did it with microphones quite a distance apart, let's say 10 metres to give us a figure, then an instrument on that side would arrive at that microphone quite quickly, but it would arrive at a microphone over there with a delay. And vice versa, an instrument in that direction would arrive at the right-hand side microphone much quicker than it would get to the left microphone. So we'd actually have a difference in volume, because one will be closer than the other, but we'd also have a difference in time, the time of arrival. Our brain is pretty good at working these things out. And what we would get would be an overemphasized spreading of left and right. Back in the early 70s, when I was a teenager, my dad got me a sit-in on a recording session in Strawberry Studios in Manchester, where they were recording the Sid Lawrence Big Band. Stereo had just become a thing in ordinary houses, and we'd just bought our first stereo system. And because it was stereo and we had two speakers, my dad put one loudspeaker in our kitchen and he put the other loudspeaker in our living room, because there were two speakers. That was the obvious way that you did it. You had no concept whatsoever of what we now know as stereo. But when I was at Strawberry, the thing that I spotted straight away was that they had clustered the big band into three groups. The drums and the bass were in the middle of the studio, and the trumpets and trombones were on one side, and the saxophones and the clarinets were on the other side. And in big band music, if you don't know, lots of times you get this sort of doo-wop style of writing the music, so that you look back at things like Glenn Miller. The trombones and the trumpets play a different rhythm to the clarinets and the saxophones, and that gives you this classic sort of big band sound. And if you record them with spaced microphones, one speaker gets clarinets and saxophones and very little else. The other speaker gets the trumpets and trombones and very little else, and both speakers get the drums and the bass. So when you listen, you've got this amazing movement between left and right as the band plays. Now, it's totally unrealistic Because if you went to see a big band, back in the Second World War time, then the only microphones that were about were either for perhaps a radio broadcast, but most typically for the band leader to actually talk to the audience. You weren't listening to an amplified band at all, it was real. And the furthest trumpet and the furthest clarinet would be a fair way apart. But there would also be nearer trumpets and clarinets much closer to centre. So the stereo field in reality was spread out over the whole thing. So that we're trying to recreate. So I don't know. Which one do you want to record? I think nowadays we're actually looking at recording as realistically as we can. We perhaps don't want clinical accuracy, but we do want a good sense of what the building sounds like and where the people making the music are within that building. And as long as we can actually close our eyes and go, yep, I can hear trumpets and trombones here, and I can hear clarinets and the saxophones here, and I know the drummer is there. If you can do that, you've recorded and captured it properly. You've done a good job of capturing the locational information that your ears do without even thinking. So that's the point of it, recreating it. So what have we got? Typically, XY, the near coincident pair. We could separate them a little bit like that. What we've done then is created our ears' way of hearing sound. So with that, we've got differences in volume between what the two microphones hear, and we've got differences in time between what the two microphones hear. Not particularly exaggerated, but there is one. Here, there is no difference in time arrival. Here, there is. Spread them about across the soundstage, and we've got an artificially enhanced width. We've actually created more width than there really is in most cases. So which system do we use? Well, we can even use that with figure of 8 microphones instead of cardio microphones to give us some pickup behind. Now, that approach is probably less common because fewer recordists have figure of 8 microphones. But if you have, using 2 figure of 8 microphones in the Blumlin technique will give you rear pickup as well. And if you're in a cathedral or you're in a wonderfully sounding concert hall, that's well worth trying. If you're in other venues, it can be a mistake, and perhaps cardioid would have been better. But we can talk about that when we do video number 19, which comes up, and that one is going to cover the choir recording. So there we go, a quick spin through basic stereo technique. XY, AB, Blumlin, or the variants. So that gets you going on basic stereo recording techniques. There's lots of things you can do, but I do have to say that the results can often be extremely subtle, and you do need to have good quality monitoring to be able to hear the differences. The one thing to put into perspective is that the differences we're talking about between that and that are extremely tiny. The one thing you must remember is monocompatibility. It's essential that a stereo recording can be reproduced in mono without it sounding weird or strange or even having instruments missing. It's easy to do. So one of the things that you must do all the time is check what you're recording in mono. I hope this has been useful. It should give you a bit better grounding before we move on to look at how to record choirs. So see you on the next one. Take care. Look after yourselves. Bye.